Market Street in Calcutta in India, and I'm standing in front of one of the oldest and biggest book markets in the world. Everywhere I look, I see these incredible piles of books which are so well balanced. It's difficult to see how one could manage such big towers of books, and it's buzzing with activity. There are people around me, mostly young people, mostly students, but also concerned parents looking for books for their children. I distinctly remember myself as a student in the 1980s when I was studying at Presidency College, Calcutta. I would have come frequenting their stores looking for books that would help me through my program. Clearly not much has changed since then. Hi, do you mind if I ask you what books you're buying today?
This is a book on Indian economy and Arms and the Man by G.V. Shaw.
And are these part of your curriculum?
Indian economy is a part of my curriculum, and Arms and the Man, I just want to go through it because I love reading books.
Can I ask you what book are you buying?
We basically have come to buy some particular books related to Shakespeare or Rabindranath Tagore because they are all moral stories.
You want to read them to enjoy them now, not as part of your study material.
We want to become a human being because for us, money is everything. Money cannot buy peace.
I'm not surprised by these responses. This city has always loved books. Indians have always loved books. Books have really gotten under our skin. So how did it all start? I'm Anandita Ghosh from the University of Manchester. And in this series, I'm going to take you on this amazing journey of print in India. Because I do believe that print, much more than the steam engine, as is usually argued, gave birth to the India we know today. The nation that was born in 1947. Before the printing press hit Indian shores, the East India Company depended on handwritten manuscripts, which had to be carried in protective casing aboard ships. It was a transformation in the 1750s of the East India Company from trading outpost to company state that catalyzed the transition to print.
There was this fear of printing amongst the Europeans, never mind the Indians. They certainly did not want the Indians to get their hands on that printing press because a free press was regarded as the first step towards kicking out the British, and that was the last thing they wanted.
Print historian Graham Shaw.
And really, I think it was the need to pass laws and to print those laws not only in English but in the local languages, Bengali, Persian and Hindustani, that really set it off. When you have to print things that you couldn't get printed in London, like in local languages using new types, you had to do it locally.
The British government's needs in India were met by the missionary presses. They had existed in small enclaves in South India from the 16th century onwards. The Portuguese were the first to introduce printing in Goa in the mid-16th century, while others like the French at Pondicherry picked it up much later. But this was a relatively later development in the subcontinent, as Gutenberg's printing press had appeared in Western Europe in around 1439. The printing press finally arrived in Calcutta, the capital of the British Raj, in 1799, when the missionary William Carey formed a Baptist settlement at Serampore. He had a second-hand English wooden printing press in his luggage. From these humble beginnings, the Serampore press evolved into one of the greatest type makers of the age, revolutionizing the world of Indian print. Serampore is on the banks of the Hooghly River. It's a lofty colonial-style building with neoclassical facade. There's a reading room inside, but this is also the old Serampore College building, and it would have made such an impression for anyone taking a boat ride down the Hooghly to look up at this building and knowing this is where the Serampore Mission Press was.
Could you see your cousin in his printing office, surrounded by 40 or 50 servants, all employed in preparing the holy scriptures for the nations of India? You would, I'm sure, be highly pleased.
We have a wonderful and vivid description of the printing office captured in a letter that William Ward, the printer missionary, wrote to his cousin in England in 1811.
You come to the presses and see 4 persons throwing off the sheets of the Bible. In one corner, you see a typecaster busy grinding the printing. And in a spacious open place, you see a paper mill and a number employed in making paper.
Early on, they decided that they wanted to be innovators, and they were very much products of the Enlightenment.
Peter de Vries is a Dutch archivist working at Serampore.
And so when they discovered that early steam engines were being employed in paper mills, they decided to buy one. But they got it shipped over from England and it was installed here. And it was a great success because suddenly they could speed up the production process, but also they found it was much more humane to use a steam engine than to have 40 people walking in a huge treadmill. The quality of the paper was much better than what you could buy locally, and that was the key because they found out early on that the local paper was eaten up by insects. Rice paste was actually used in the process of making it.
And the improved paper quality was a key factor in popularizing the mission's publications. So this really was very, very useful, the steam engine.
The locals refer to it as Carey's idol, and that's quite ironic because it's the last thing that he wanted to happen, of course. There were already steam trains running, but it was the first steam engine that was ever used in India in a paper mill.
And I can't tell you how amazed I am to be standing in front of it and looking at it, having read about it.
The first pages that rolled off the press that was set up here in Serampore in 1800 was the Gospel of Matthew in Bengali. And then subsequently we find that over the next 70 years almost, many thousands and thousands of books and pamphlets and documents have been printed on the Serampore press. So we see here the first pages of 40 odd Bibles and New Testaments that have been printed on the press, and most of those, about 30, went through the hands of William Carey and were checked by him before they were actually printed.
Right, and look at the range of languages represented here, 48 different languages, and not just languages of India or South Asia. We have translations in Chinese, in Arabic, Armenian, Javanese. I mean, what a range. William Carey's Serampore Press didn't just produce proselytizing literature. It also printed textbooks for local schools and Bengali language primers for the British civil servants of the East India Company. Also significantly, the first Bengali newspaper, Samachar Darpan, issued from the Serampore presses, and these pages were often read aloud in the towns and villages, giving them a wide reach amongst the Indian population. The next chapter of the story of print in India opened with the huge demand for educational books across the subcontinent. The colonial government needed English-speaking Indians to run its administration and set up a wide network of schools and colleges offering Western-style education. A proliferation of English printed material followed. It's so lovely to be back here in my old college, Presidency University in Calcutta, as it celebrates its bicentenary year. So this is 200 years to the week that this college was founded. And as I stand looking up at those grand columns and the very impressive porch with the clock perched right at the top of the building, it brings back not just my personal memories of this institution, but also the grand history that it represents. This, in its heydays, was known as the Eton of the East. This was the first Western-style higher education institution in India, founded for the purpose of educating Hindus in English. This was their favored medium of instruction. It was the language in which they could speak to the wider world. It was an essential medium for Bengalis. With the arrival of Western-style education, European philosophy, history, science and literature filled up Indian shelves. and literary clubs and societies mushroomed in towns and cities. But this wasn't a case of passive cultural colonialism. Indians embraced the Western literary canon, but they also made it their own. As Professor Shapan Chakraborty, the Tagore Distinguished Chair at Presidency University, explained to me.
English literature, when it did come to India, didn't come in a sequence. We had the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement hitting us all together. So people say that the British brought Western education, but this is not the education in the West, not in that order. So printed English literature taught in class was very different.
I wondered if I could push you further down that line and ask you about the impact of Shakespeare as well, because the empire carries Shakespeare with it wherever it goes. In what ways do you think Shakespeare has left a legacy in India?
Shakespeare always has this political charge. When Indians read Shakespeare, there seems to be a kind of cultural association, collective memory, which still carries that charge. Even if you see the productions of Shakespeare today, anytime there is something that has to do with the fetid world of politics, the Indian theatre will produce a Hamlet.
I am very proud, revengeful, ambitious, with more offenses at my beck than I have thoughts to put them in, imagination to give them shape, or time to act them in.
Every time there is a hint of tyranny in the air, they will produce a Macbeth.
Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury.
Sectarian violence, they will bring in Tempest.
How beauteous mankind is. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it.
They have no time for much ado about nothing. A Midsummer Night's Dream, not very popular, not a great success. This is not just true of the early 19th century, it's true today.
The cultural exchange taking place in the 19th century was a two-way street. European classics and scientific texts were eagerly devoured by Indians, while ancient Indian scriptural works found their way to foreign shores. European scholars, also known as Orientalists, immersed themselves in studies of classical India, setting off a deep interest in the subcontinent among the British public. This college represents the crossroads of Western and Eastern education. On the one hand, of course, there were European teachers and European literature and European texts that the Indian students were imbibing. On the other hand, it was also a great opportunity for Indian students to talk to their professors about their own traditions and their own literature. This print revolution initiated the intellectual flowering in the 19th century that we now call the Bengal Renaissance. Print helped dramatically expand the borders of the reading community and initiated an exchange of ideas with the world on an unprecedented scale. Indians participated in the intellectual revolution to form their own thoughts on society, community, and the nation. Rabindranath Tagore is perhaps our best known literary giant to emerge from the Bengal Renaissance.
Rabindranath Tagore said that we came to the world through the English language. Now we can make a world which is not European.
This was undoubtedly the era of great public intellectuals. For educationists like Vidyasagar, poets like Madhusudan, and religious leaders like Vivekananda, the society around them needed to be questioned. There were literary achievements too. By the end of the 19th century, prose, blank verse, and novels had all been introduced in Bengali literature for the first time.
So Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, our best known and most famous Bengali novelist of the latter half of the 19th century, actually mentions the steam engine and the printing press as the two things that will enable Bengali culture to flower. He says these two things are knocking on our door and we must use them in order to fashion our own modernity.
Rosenka Chaudhary, Professor of Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta.
So this story of printing needs really to be told as something that signifies modernity to Bengalis living in Calcutta at that time, not just to the elites like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who then used it to fashion a literary revival and create this wonderful thing that is called the Bengal Renaissance, but also from all classes of Bengalis themselves, people who didn't have very much English, people then begin printing Bengali language texts. So yes, it's this wonderful amalgam of commerce, education, and literary revival that is all happening in this melee almost that was the public sphere in Bengal at this time.
Europeans had initiated printing in Bengal, but indigenous enterprise wasn't far behind. In 1835, the English lifted the ban on the ownership of presses, and this allowed Indians to take the initiative.
You didn't have castes of printers in Indian society, and so printing gives a new lease of life to the blacksmiths.
Yes, the metal
lohas,
workers.
Yeah, who take up printing, typecasting, and the most famous case is Panchanan Karmaka. Karmaka means metal worker, blacksmith, and he works with Charles Wilkins, the man who is sometimes called the Caxton of India, the man who set up the press for the East India Company, and usually gets all the credit for everything, but in fact, Panchanan Karmaka was absolutely key. Wilkins was a type designer, he was a civil servant, he wasn't a metal worker, he couldn't have cast Bengali types and Persian types and so on. This was down to Karmaka who did this. And so we get this transfer of technology into the Indian population and then it takes off.
Over the course of the 19th century, the sea of small Indian presses furthered this cacophonous print revolution by carrying the printed word to more popular levels of readership. In the last 30 years of the 19th century alone, 200,000 titles were published, far more than the total output in France during the Age of Enlightenment. The colonial government were keen to keep an eye on this new print that was emerging, and employed the missionary Reverend James Long to survey the vernacular publishing scene in Bengal. Despite his missionary disapproval, these small presses did a particularly brisk trade in cheap and cheerful pulp literature. I've just walked off the main street into a small cafe in Chitpur in Calcutta, and I'm sipping a cup of chai. And this was that historic part of the city that used to be called the Black Town. By the second half of the 19th century, this place was teeming with presses pouring out Bengali books by their thousands for widespread consumption. You could find elite Bengali presses further down the road, but this was the Grub Street of Calcutta, selling its penny dreadfuls, very affordable therefore for the wider Bengali reading public.
A person may be 20 years in Calcutta,
In 1859, the Reverend Long reported,
and yet scarcely know that any Bengali books are printed by Bengalis themselves. He must visit the native part of town and the Chitpur Road. The native presses are generally in by-lanes, with little outside to attract attention, yet they ply a busy trade.
there were people like Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya who had worked as a compositor in the Serampore press. And he's enterprising enough to print the first Bengali commercial publication, which is Onna the Mongol, which is basically a Bengali legend full of all kinds of adventures and even quite erotic in parts. And this is the first commercial book in Bengali, and it does immensely well.
Annapurna Mahamaya, grant me refuge at your feet. You are the supreme goddess, the bestower of happiness.
The book market in Calcutta really comes of age around owned such commercial printed publications.
What lovely thighs, gurus of the trunk of the banana tree. You have so thin a waist, a navel like a lake of nectar. You reveal the 14 worlds.
Of course, the colonials never realized fully what these publications were about. In the most commonsensical sense, they saw these as obscene publications. Again, the missionaries are at the heart of this. They don't like these publications doing so well.
They could see obscenity in almost everything that was produced in Hindu verse. A lot of Hindu devotional poetry in praise of the gods was blasted as erotic and outrageous and obscene, whereas to an Indian audience it was nothing of the kind. I mean, a work like Bidya Sundar, which was a very famous work, very popular in Bengal, was blasted by the Reverend James Long. He was pushing the Christian point of view. So there was a little bit of an imposition of a sort of Victorian view of morality.
Administration came down especially heavily in the late 19th century, and an Obscenity Act was passed to prevent the sale of obscene books and pictures. As the seized publications came pouring into the office of the Bengal librarian John Robinson, the task of going through them proved so time-consuming and distasteful to him that he asked to be transferred to another job. Of course, it wasn't just texts. There was a whole market for printed images, secular and religious, that were pinned up on walls in houses. These also fell under the watchful colonial gaze.
What this cartoon is dead. He's making fun of the fact that Kali is always shown naked. She doesn't wear anything because she is absolutely elemental, representing fierce, cosmic kind of power.
The Obscenity Act was poked fun at in a cartoon of Kali and Shiva that Professor Parthamita has found in Boshantok, the satirical Bengali newspaper of the time.
And the cartoon, what he's done is, he has dressed her in long skirt and blouse and handbag, and now she has been very well dressed, and so is Shiva. So poor Shiva is wearing tweed, I think, Jake, with braces.
It's clearly trying to show how Kali looks literally unnatural when fully clothed. So whatever the British are trying to do with the reform of traditional society, they're clearly getting it wrong. So by purging what is obscene, we're actually taking out gems in our national canon. Such a popular and vigorous market could not be wiped out by a single act of prohibition. The cheapness of the publications and the enormity of the demand ensured its covert survival. এইটা সব থেকে পুরনো প্রেস চিতপুরে সো দিস ইজ দ্য ওল্ডেস্ট প্রেস ইন চিতপুর কত বয়স এটা কত পুরনো হাউ ওল্ড ইজ দিস এই আপনার এটা 80 So I've just walked into a little shop. This is along Chitpur Road. This is where the book presses would have been in those times. And even today, it's not surprising to find that printers are still operating, the old printing presses. And I have with me Mr. A.K. Seal, who has a press which is 120 years old, a press which is still functioning and running. And it's called the Silverland Press, imported from the US. I can smell the oil and I can see that it's been very, very lovingly maintained. This is a piece of history for me. I'm so thrilled to see this. In another print shop along the Chitpur Road called the Diamond Library, I met two brothers who were directly descended from Ritulal Sheel, who was a major publisher in the 19th century and who I had come across in my archive search. This business has been running continuously for 139 years. So the original press I have very interestingly discovered was in the actual Bottala area, which is just further down the road. And there was a huge banyan tree and people would sit under the shade of the tree, sell the books and then wrap up business and go away again in the evening. And that is probably how this ancestor, Nadir Chand Sheel, first started his business. The Bengal Renaissance became the model for the rest of India. As printing took off in the late 19th century, it traveled to Bombay and finally to the northern part of India in an unstoppable migration across the subcontinent.
What print enabled at that time, I think, is comparable only to what the internet has enabled now. A boy in a village in Bihar, if he has internet connection and has a computer, in the manner in which he can access all this information, I think that the only parallel that is possible with what is happening with this explosion of print is really an explosion of information. Information technology is the term used now for the internet, but I think that's what print was, information technology actually, that enabled all of this to happen in these towns and cities.
I have come down to the banks of the river Hooghly in Calcutta, and I'm looking out at the Howrah Bridge. So the first bridge was built in 1874. This was a floating wooden bridge supported by a series of boats, which took 3 years to build. It was an amazing technological feat. Now, of course, it's a massive metal structure. And life by the river just goes on, with people milling around the carts, taking their dip in the holy Ganges, and hence the real sense of surprise when the 1874 bridge was built. People could just not fathom how the mighty Ganges, mighty Ganga, could be shackled by iron. Calcuttans had never seen anything like this before. They were amazed by it and they wrote prolifically about it. There were songs that were sung and printed about the Howrah Bridge.
Oh, what a bridge has been built by the Sahib Company. How could a bridge be built over the Ganga? Even Vishwakarma has admitted defeat. Such intelligence and skill. All can easily cross the river now.
And people were generally excited by technology, so it wasn't just the bridge, but there's a series of poems and songs about tramways, about gas lights, about public drains. All of this is captured in print. So this is not just a celebration of British engineering and technology, but it's also a veiled critique of the Bengali elite and a questioning of their abilities to lead the local society. And this is so crucial because it shows us how people are using print to participate in wider discussions about the society around them, which over time becomes receptive to ideas of nationalism and India's self-identity. And this is something I'm going to explore in the next program.